Hello, students. I want you to just take a moment and imagine something. Imagine you're living in a huge, vast empire, so big it stretches across 2 continents. And in this empire, one single person's word is the law. Whatever he says, goes. Well, that was the reality for people in the Russian Empire before the year 1917. The ruler was an all-powerful man called the Tsar. In today's lesson, we are going to go back in time to understand what life was actually like for the millions of people living under his rule. So let's begin.
Okay, so here's what we are going to cover today. First, we'll look at Russia under the Tsar. Then we will look into the lives of the largest groups of people, the peasants who worked in the villages and the new workers in the cities. After that, we will see how the society was divided, how the government kept such tight control, and finally, we'll put all the pieces together to understand why a big revolution was about to happen.
All right, so let's start at the very top. We'll begin with the man who ruled this massive empire, the Tsar. You see, if we understand his power, it's the key to understanding everything else that was happening in Russia back then.
This person you see here, this is Tsar Nicholas II. In the year 1914, he was the ruler. And when we say the Russian Empire, I want you to understand it was not just the Russia we see on the map today. No, it was a huge empire, including places like Finland, Poland, and many parts of Central Asia. A truly massive area.
Now, the Tsar's system of ruling had a special name. It was called autocracy. What does this word mean? It's quite simple, really. An autocracy is a system where one person, just one, holds all the power. Absolute power, with no one to control him. So the Tsar's rule was an autocracy. This means he was the final authority. His word wasn't just the law, it was the only law that really mattered.
And this is very important, because it made Russia very different from other countries in Europe at the time. For example, if you think about Britain, they had a parliament. The king or queen there had to work with people who were elected. But in Russia, there was nothing like that to limit the Tsar's power. He believed he answered only to God. This made Russia politically unique and very far behind its neighbors.
Okay, so we've seen how Russia was ruled from the top. Now let's look at the people who were being ruled. To really, truly understand Russia, we must understand the life of a peasant. Why? Because they were the heart and soul of the country. They were the huge majority of the population.
And I mean a huge majority. Just look at this number. About 85% of all the people in the Russian Empire were agriculturists. They worked on farms. Now, to put that in perspective, in countries like France or Germany, that number was much, much lower, around 40 or 50%. So a common mistake students make is thinking Russia was full of industrial workers. But that's not true. It was first and foremost a land of peasants and farmers.
So what was the biggest problem for these peasants? Well, here it is. Imagine this. You work on a piece of land your whole life. Your father worked on it before you, and your grandfather before him. But you don't own it. You have no right to it. This was the reality for millions. The land, you see, was owned by others, the rich nobles, the Tsar's own family, and the Orthodox Church. So naturally, the peasants deeply, deeply wanted that land. They felt it should be theirs.
And this wasn't just a quiet sadness. This anger often boiled over. What did they do? Well, they often refused to pay rent to the landlords, and sometimes it got much more violent. They would even attack and murder the landlords. This shows you how deep their anger was. It wasn't just a small problem. It was a huge simmering issue in the countryside.
Now, there was something very unique about Russian peasants, a special custom. They had something called the mir, which means commune. What they would do is pool all their land together, and then the commune would divide it up among the families, depending on how big each family was and what they needed. This created a habit of thinking collectively, of sharing. So later, when new ideas like socialism started to come, ideas about sharing wealth, many Russian peasants were naturally open to it. It was a way of life they already practiced.
So we have this anger building up in the countryside with the peasants. At the same time, another group with its own problems was growing in the cities. These were the industrial workers. Now, there weren't as many of them as the peasants, but they were all concentrated in a few places, and they were becoming a new and powerful group pushing for change.
You see, Russia started building factories much later than other European countries, and the factories weren't everywhere. They were mostly in a few pockets, big cities like St. Petersburg and Moscow. What helped this happen was the building of railways in the 1890s. The new railways made it easier to bring in money from other countries and transport materials to build things.
Now just look at these pictures. This gives you an idea of what life was like for a factory worker. They had to leave their villages, their families, and come to the city. And what did they find? They lived in these crowded dormitories or barracks. There was no privacy. Often they couldn't even bring their families with them. This was a very hard, very lonely life, and it made them very, very unhappy.
And the work itself? It was exhausting. A normal working day could be 10 to 12 hours long in a factory. In smaller workshops, it could be even longer, up to 15 hours. Now, the government did have some rules about working hours and minimum wages, but factory owners often just broke these rules. They knew they could get away with it, so the workers were paid very little for very long hours of work.
But it's important to remember that the workers were not all the same. They were divided. For example, a metal worker who had special skills and training thought of himself as better than other, less skilled workers. They even called themselves the aristocrats of the workers. This kind of division by skill level sometimes made it hard for all the workers to come together and fight for their rights.
By 1914, there were also many women working in the factories, almost 1/3 of all workers. But they had an even harder time. They worked the same long hours, in the same bad conditions as the men, but they were paid much less. Sometimes a woman was paid only half of what a man earned for doing the same job. This was a huge injustice.
Okay, so now we have seen these two very large, very unhappy groups, the peasants in the villages and the workers in the cities. Let's just take a moment to put them side by side and compare them so we can really see the similarities and differences. If you look at this comparison, you can see their situations were different in many ways. The peasants were the huge majority, and their main connection was to the land. The workers were a smaller group, growing in the cities. Their biggest demands were also different. Peasants wanted to own the land they farmed. Workers wanted better pay and working conditions. But, and this is the most important point, despite their differences, they were both suffering. Both groups were very, very unhappy with how things were, and both wanted a big change.
So, a natural question comes to mind. With all this anger among both peasants and workers, why didn't they just form groups in protest? Why didn't they demand change? The answer is simple, and it is harsh. They were not allowed to. The Tsar's government made sure of it.
Now please pay close attention to this. This is very important for your exams. In Russia before 1914, all political parties were illegal. You could not form a party to express your views. If you did, you could be arrested by the police. The government had secret police everywhere watching people. So people who wanted change, like the socialists, had to do everything in secret. They had to form illegal organizations and work underground.
Okay, so let's summarize everything we have learned. I think the best way to imagine Russia at this time is to think of a pressure cooker. You know, the kind used for cooking? There are many different things inside, all building up pressure, building up steam, getting ready to explode.
So what were the things building pressure inside this cooker? Let's list them. First, you have the autocracy, a ruler with absolute power who would not listen to anyone. That's one pressure. Second, you have the problem of the peasants, a huge population angry because they did not have land. That's the second pressure. And third, you have the problem of the workers, a new group facing terrible conditions and having no rights. That's the third pressure. Any one of these problems would be serious, but all three together, it was a recipe for revolution.
So you can see how this combination of things, an unbending government, angry peasants, and suffering workers, created a very, very unstable situation in Russia. It was as if all the fuel for a huge fire was piled up, just waiting for a single spark to set it all off. The stage was set for the great changes that were coming.
So I will leave you with a question to think about. When you have a rigid government on top that refuses to change and millions of people at the bottom who are suffering so much, is a revolution bound to happen? Was it inevitable? We will start to find the answer to that in our next lesson when we look at the first big event that shook the Tsar's rule, the Revolution of 1905.